The Astral World, Higher Occult Powers, by Tiffany. Chapter 1. On the Determination of Truth. In commencing the investigation of spiritualism, it becomes necessary at the outset that we find some point of departure from which to begin our examination. For, in the pursuit of truth, we must identify some standard by which truth may be determined, since, unless we possess an infallible criterion to which we can appeal, however extensively we may investigate, we shall always remain uncertain as to the accuracy of our conclusions. Man, as a conscious being endowed with the faculty of perceiving being and existence, and being likewise susceptible to the influence of that which he perceives, becomes himself the center of all his investigations within the universe. And if any standard exists by which to test truth, he must find that standard within his own consciousness. External to human consciousness, there exists for him no standard of truth. I shall briefly illustrate my meaning, so that you may perceive how I wish to direct you in investigating the question. What is truth, and how shall it be determined? The science of mathematics is said to be certain and demonstrative. And why is the science of mathematics more demonstrable than any other science? Why is it that the truth which it affirms can be more positively demonstrated than any other truth? Is it because number and quantity are more fixed and certain than are the qualities and attributes of being and existence? Why is it that the affirmations of mathematics are more demonstrable than the truths of any other science? I answer that this is simply owing to the mode of proceeding in our investigations. If we adopt the same process that we do in mathematics, we can obtain the same certainty upon all other questions that fall within the sphere of man's perceptions and affections. The mathematician descends into his own consciousness and finds certain conscious affirmations pertaining to number and quantity. He records them as truths not to be disregarded, and designates them as self-evident truths or axioms. They are such affirmations of consciousness as everyone must, perforce, admit to be true, and when he has obtained the affirmations of his consciousness pertaining to number and quantity, he records them as truths not to be disregarded. They are always true everywhere, and under all circumstances, where number and quantity are to be investigated. He assumes nothing to be true which conflicts with these conscious affirmations of the soul. That things equal to the same thing are equal to one another must be received as true throughout the wide universe, so far as the mathematician investigates, and he allows nothing to controvert that self-evident truth, and so of all other affirmations. He allows nothing, in his investigations, to conflict at all, and whatever does conflict, he affirms to be false. Then, before he takes another step, he is very careful to establish accurate definitions, so that we may know precisely what he means, may understand exactly the scope of what he says. For instance, in speaking of geometry, he will say that it pertains to the measurement of extension, and extension has 3 dimensions: length, breadth, and thickness. He next proceeds to give definitions of that which is necessary to bound space, explaining what is a straight line, what a curved line, what is a plane surface, what a curved surface, and so forth. Having ascertained the affirmations of the consciousness of the soul in respect to number and quantity, and having fixed accurately upon the definition of all terms to be used, he then commences his demonstration, and will not proceed one step faster than demonstration accompanies him, eschewing all conjecture. He makes the relation between premises and conclusion inevitable, and if there be not an inevitable relation, he does not establish his proposition mathematically. Now, what is true in respect to mathematics is true in respect to every other subject that may come before the mind. There are conscious affirmations of the soul lying at the basis of all investigation, and in these conscious affirmations of the soul is to be found the standard by which to try the truth of any plane or sphere of thought. The first step to be taken is to ascertain what are the affirmations of the soul upon those points to be investigated. Our next step is to establish certain definitions, so that we can always understand precisely what we mean in our use of terms. Then we must ensure that the relation between premises and conclusion is always inevitable. There must never be left any opportunity for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. Then we shall always be certain of possessing the truth. In investigating the science of mind and spirit, I propose to pursue this mathematical course, and not attempt to argue any point that is not capable of demonstration, that is not based upon the absolute affirmation of the soul, conducted with reference to strict definitions, and making the relation of premises and conclusion inevitable. The reason for being thus meticulous is that the greatest confusion prevails, not only in respect to the subject of the new philosophy or spiritualism, but in respect to all subjects pertaining to spiritual life. Man does not know precisely where to begin his investigation. He does not seem to know precisely where he is certain of anything pertaining to spiritual existence, and thinks that it must be entirely conjectural. Now, here is an affirmation which I believe every individual in the audience will agree to be an affirmation of universal consciousness, and one that lies at the basis of all our investigations of this and every other subject. Then the first affirmation of consciousness is this: that the mind can perceive nothing but its own consciousness, and that which is inwrought into that consciousness. Now, I wish you to test this in every possible manner to see if it be true. We speak of acquiring information and forming ideas from subjects external to ourselves, as though they existed independently of our minds. My proposition is that the mind can perceive nothing but its own consciousness, and that which is inwrought into that consciousness, and, furthermore, that its perception of being and existence will correspond to how they are inwrought into its consciousness, and by no possibility can it be anything else to the individual. Consequently, if there be any standard anywhere by which to test truth and know that it is true, that standard must be inwrought into the consciousness of the individual who must apply it, and he will apply it accordingly as it is inwrought into his consciousness. Now, is there anyone who does not perceive that this is absolutely true? Receiving this, then, as a truth which every mind affirms, since the mind cannot conceive the contrary to be true, we must regard everything as false which conflicts with this proposition, irrespective of whether it overthrows authority. Whatever conflicts with this self-evident truth or affirmation of universal consciousness must be false. Truth does not conflict with truth. One may be assured that falsehood always exists where conflict and antagonism are found. It follows, then, that all there is of being or of existence in the universe that will ever be known to you or to me will be that which is inwrought into our consciousness. It follows, as a matter of course, that the universe can be no larger and no more perfect than it can be inwrought into our consciousness, and it will be limited to us by our mental unfolding. Hence, it will necessarily follow that different individuals, who are differently unfolded in the various departments of their intellectual and perceptive natures, will perceive being and existence in very different lights, and yet each will suppose that he sees it in the same light until we begin to compare notes. There will be as many distinct versions of New York as there are minds capable of conceiving or imagining that city. Likewise, there must exist as many disparate mental earths or mental universes as there are intellects to formulate conceptions of our planet and the cosmos. Each individual mind will perceive the earth or the universe as it is fashioned within his own consciousness, and when it undertakes an investigation, it will examine only that which is fashioned therein, studying it in that precise form. It follows, consequently, as a matter of course, that when the image of existence within our consciousness corresponds to actuality, that is, when the ideal in man aligns with the real in God, only then does man possess the truth and not before. That is to say, when my perception of being and existence corresponds with objective being and existence, I have attained the truth thereof. Yet, precisely to the degree that my conception or perception of being or existence deviates from its actuality, to that same extent is my impression erroneous. These conclusions follow of necessity. Hence, we shall perceive immediately that the primary lesson to be acquired in commencing our study of the universe is to know ourselves. The very first volume opened before us is that which God has bestowed upon us in granting us a conscious existence. Here we must initiate our first lesson, for all things must be recorded upon the pages of this volume. God can never manifest any portion of the universe or of himself to us beyond the capacity of the pages of this volume to receive such a manifestation. It follows, consequently, as a matter of course, that truth can never be communicated merely by authority, and when an individual asserts that a certain proposition is true upon his own authority, I cannot accept it solely upon his assertion. You will understand that I draw a distinction between declaring a truth and narrating a fact. I may indeed accept a statement of fact upon authority. A person may inform me of the existence of a place called London, and I may credit his assertion. I may likewise formulate a conception regarding it, yet the ideal London of my imagination is vastly different from the actual city. It is far from being a true representation of the real London. That is to say, the ideal London in my mind exists solely within my intellect, possessing no corresponding counterpart in the objective London of fact. However, once the actual London is introduced into my consciousness, I truly possess the concept of London. Prior to that, I possessed merely a semblance of it. From this, you will comprehend the distinction between conceiving a fact and perceiving a truth. Suppose I were to assert that the sum of the squares of the two sides of a right-angled triangle is equal to the square of its hypotenuse. If you have confidence in my capacity to discern the truth, you might declare, I shall accept this as a fact. Yet you would possess no intrinsic perception of its truth, having only my testimony for it. In this instance, your faith lies not in the truth of the proposition, but in my veracity. A truth indeed exists there, but you cannot receive it upon my authority. The reception of it as a truth depends upon your own intellect being elevated to the plane of that truth. The question we must resolve, therefore, is whether the conception within our minds corresponds to objective reality. If we possess the means to determine that such a correspondence exists, then we possess the means to verify that our perception is true. Truth is the intellect's perception of that which is. This rule may be applied to any domain of inquiry you choose. Let us, then, begin with man as a microcosm of the universe, destined in his spiritual development to become a microcosm of all that exists in the cosmos. In other words, an entity whose mind is to begin translating the universe into its own consciousness. The universe is a magnificent volume which it is man's task to read and translate into his consciousness, so that the internal image matches the external reality, so that he may become a universe unto himself, and so that the individual, in his affection by that which is assimilated, also becomes divine, a god. Is it not written in your law, I said, ye are gods? Man is destined to become, in his impulses and character, akin to the divine nature of the universe, so that he possesses not only all wisdom, fact, and principle, but also all the affection of the universe, namely, the divine love translated into his own affections, rendering him, in his outward form and inward being, a child of God, created in his image. Thus, to the degree that we progress day by day in translating the actual and real universe into the perceptive and ideal within ourselves, we rapidly expand and grow in knowledge. And when that knowledge is united with truth, and our emotional impulses are converted into wisdom, we are fashioned into temples for the indwelling of the divine spirit. It behooves us, therefore, to employ every resource at our disposal to comprehend this great volume which God has opened before us, providing us with the means to study it, translate it into our minds, and make it our own. Viewing man, then, as a conscious being, one endowed with the faculty of perceiving existence in all its diverse modes of manifestation, as well as perceiving being itself, thereby possessing within himself the tablet upon which God can write not only phenomena, but the law and science of existence itself, let us become free men, lovers of truth, resolved to be honest with ourselves and the world, determined to know what can be known, and refusing to be deceived by our own appetites, passions, or desires, or by the influences that others might exert to divert our minds from a sincere and faithful investigation of all matters. The mind that fears to gaze upon the vast universe, or to receive the image that God would impress upon it every day and moment of life, is denying the very birthright of its soul. Man, as a conscious being, is subject to 3 distinct degrees of conscious perception. He can be subject to neither more nor less, and, being influenced by what he perceives, to 3 degrees of affection. In other words, a foundation is established for 3 spheres of thought and 3 spheres of affection. He can possess neither more nor less than these. It is my purpose to demonstrate this truth in such a manner that every one of you shall recognize its validity. I shall begin by proving that these spheres of knowledge and affection exist within you, because my task, having established this, should I succeed in doing so, will be to demonstrate that within the vast universe there exist only those same 3 spheres of knowledge and those same 3 spheres of affection and love, neither more nor less, and that man contains within himself the elements of all knowledge and affection present throughout the cosmos. Were he not possessed of these elements, he would be incapable of investigating the universe, for one can only examine that of which the constituent elements reside within one's own consciousness. First, man possesses that faculty by which he perceives the mere phenomena of existence. That is to say, he possesses that dimension of conscious being which is addressed by what we term the physical senses, the purpose of which is to disclose to him facts and phenomena upon the material plane of existence. The physical senses can reveal only these facts and phenomena. In this regard, man differs in no wise from the beast, which possesses the same number of physical senses, is affected by the same light that strikes the senses of man, and is subject to the identical conditions. The law by which perception is awakened in the consciousness is the same in the animal as in the human being. Yet man also possesses another element, one that is dissatisfied with mere investigation or the simple observation of forms and phenomena. We observe this additional nature manifested in the young child, once he begins to walk and to contemplate the forms of objects. There are certain matters he cannot ascertain through the employment of his physical senses, whereupon he inquires of his parents for further instruction. If one examines the philosophy of inquiry, it becomes apparent that asking questions is a method of acquiring knowledge through the exercise of faculties superior to the physical senses. This is the pursuit of information to be applied to consciousness, represented by ideas residing within the mind. One may conceive of Sir Isaac Newton and his canine companion seated within an orchard, both observing an apple descend to the earth. While the animal was capable of observing the physical occurrence as clearly as Sir Isaac, the philosopher perceived an underlying principle inherent in the fall of that apple, a concept entirely beyond the comprehension of the beast. The dog restricted its observation to the mere physical event. Sir Isaac, however, by virtue of a superior intellectual faculty, discerned the existence of a governing law which he sought to determine, thereby initiating an investigation to uncover it. This mental province, which impelled Sir Isaac Newton to undertake his inquiry, remained unsatisfied with the mere observation of existential facts or phenomena, desiring instead to investigate the underlying agencies responsible for their production. This faculty engenders in humanity a secondary sphere of consciousness, which looks beyond superficial phenomena to investigate their governing laws or proximate causes, thereby inaugurating the domains of science and philosophy. Consequently, this second sphere of thought is dedicated to investigating the relations among entities and determining the laws of action and manifestation arising from those relations. It pertains to what may be termed the relational, intermediary, or mediatorial sphere, as it encompasses the mechanisms through which causes operate to yield effects. To illustrate, I speak and you hear. I act as the cause producing a vocalization. Your auditory organs are affected by the resulting sound. The atmosphere serves as the medium through which this action is transmitted from my vocal organs to your auditory apparatus. The physical senses perceive the occurrence within the material realm, whereas intellectual perceptions discern the means by which the occurrence is brought about. Beyond this lies the highest, most internal, and absolute nature, which perceives the ultimate cause of these effects. Thus, there exists within the human mind a sphere that merely observes the effect, a sphere that investigates the relations or laws by which phenomena are generated, and a sphere that seeks after and apprehends the absolute cause of such phenomena. Now, insofar as all existence must fall within one of these classifications, either the phenomenon itself, the means of its production, or the primary cause which, through those means, engendered it, there can exist only these three departments of conscious perception: the physical or intellectual, the moral or relational, and the divine or absolute, which apprehends the absolute foundation of all being. To illustrate the distinction between the relational and the absolute, when Sir Isaac Newton demonstrated the existence of the law of gravitation, identifying it as the same principle governing the movement of celestial bodies, it was widely assumed that he had discovered the cause of their motion. He designated this law as attraction, or the attraction of gravitation. Yet, if we query Sir Isaac Newton asking what is the attraction of gravitation, the sole possible response is to describe its effects. No matter how profound the intellect, it must remain ignorant of the absolute, for the intellect operates strictly within the domain of relations. One can neither analyze nor compare the infinite. It is exclusively within the realm of the finite that intellectual faculties possess the capacity to conduct their inquiries. That which apprehends the absolute must itself be absolute, for the finite cannot contain the infinite, nor can the finite encompass it. Consequently, if the infinite is ever to be manifested to humanity, there must exist a mental province receptive to it, and that province must itself be infinite, lest it fail to receive the infinite. When I expound more specifically upon this theme, I shall endeavor to render it clear to you, so far as the limitations of language permit. Corresponding to these three spheres of perception are three spheres of affection. The first is designated the sphere of self-love, or, to employ a term of universal application, I would style it lust, that is, the appetite for self-gratification. This represents the lowest domain pertaining to the finite, corresponding directly to the sphere of physical facts or phenomena. The second sphere comprises relational love, which naturally bifurcates into two divisions: the love of inanimate nature, sciences, and the like, and the love of conscious existence or moral love, through which an individual loves his neighbor, an external conscious being. This is the secondary sphere of affection, termed relational, which aligns with the sphere of relational truth, or the domain of intellectual and moral inquiry. There exists a tertiary sphere of impulse or affection, recognized as divine or absolute love, often designated as the love of God, or the love of the infinite. Within one of these three spheres, every individual's ruling affection resides, either in the sphere of self-love, pursuing personal gratification, in the sphere of moral love, seeking the welfare of one's neighbor, or in the sphere of divine love, loving as God loves, universally and subjectively, encompassing the entirety of the universe. Indeed, there can exist only these three spheres. If you examine your own nature, you will readily identify at least two of the affections to which I have directed your attention: self-love and social love. More specifically, self-love manifests as the desire for self-gratification, the yearning that one's own happiness be secured first, leaving the rest of the world to find contentment thereafter. The love that transcends the self, directing itself toward an external being, is exemplified in the devotion of a faithful husband to his wife, of a parent to a child, and of a brother to a sister. All such affections signify the presence of the second sphere of love, known as charity or goodwill toward one's neighbor. This love serves as the instrument through which self-love is initially subdued or eradicated. Thus, the individual is elevated from self-love through the medium of charity to divine love, just as, in the realm of cognition, he is raised from the sphere of mere fact through relational understanding to the absolute of being. Consequently, in the developmental spheres of unfolding, these three degrees are of necessity absolute. Consider society. What is it but the aggregate of the individuals who compose it? Apart from these individuals, society is non-existent. The love of society is merely the love of this collective body of individuals. Since affection must belong to the sphere of either self-love, charity, or divine love, society will invariably reflect one of these three principles, though never, as yet, the third. When observing the principles governing its administration, we say of society that it is merely the embodiment of the character and will of those who constitute the governing authority. It is but the collective expression of its constituent members. Consequently, there exist three spheres of government, corresponding to the three spheres of the individual. For individuals dwelling within their lower, selfish nature, government must of necessity be a government of coercion. Conversely, the individual who has transcended this state obeys the truth out of love for the truth. He does not feel the restraints of laws declaring, "Thou shalt not steal," or "Thou shalt not lie." Indeed, he may scarcely be aware of such statutes within the state, having never experienced their restraint. Such an individual no longer resides within the sphere of self-love. Thus, the governance applied to him is not one of physical force, but a moral governance established within his own affections. Emerging from the government of force, humanity enters the second Christian or moral dispensation, the government of charity. He then comes under the influence of the commandment, that ye love one another. This secondary or mediatorial sphere is inherently moral. Hence, this era has been designated the mediatorial dispensation. Therefore, I submit that there exists a second sphere of government or a second dispensation, as it has been termed. Yet that dispensation is merely the magnification of the individual, representing society as a singular, unified organism. Furthermore, there exists a prophecy concerning the third and perfect dispensation, designated as the millennial or divine dispensation. Once the second has completed its mediatorial function, and when every individual has attained moral perfection and is prepared to receive the divine influx, there shall emerge this third dispensation of governance, properly termed the millennial. If we examine the terminology by which it is designated, we discover that it is described as occurring at the consummation of the age, or the end of the epoch, when that mediatorial era has concluded and humanity, perfected in its moral nature, has subjugated all external rule and authority. At that juncture, Christ himself becomes subject to the Father, and God, the divine, becomes all in all. This ushers in the third dispensation the tertiary sphere of governance. These three dimensions of love within man establish the foundation for the spheres manifested in the spiritual realm. Secular governments, no less than celestial ones, possess their foundation in the human being. Man represents the ultimate summation of all preceding epochs, and the spiritual worlds find their very foundation in him. Consequently, when we desire to investigate the spiritual spheres, to discern what constitutes a sphere and a degree, we are under no obligation to project our inquiries outward, gazing into spatial depths 10, 15, or 1,000 miles distant. Such is not the method by which the spiritual world is to be studied. Rather, one must turn inward to examine the spheres of spiritual existence and affection. Individuals residing within any of these states are allied with one of the three corresponding spheres in the spiritual world. The first is designated as the lowest or the dark sphere, the realm of outer darkness, occasionally referred to as the grave. The grave was historically depicted as a repository of darkness, devoid of knowledge, device, or wisdom, and it was to this state that Scripture alluded when declaring that those in their graves shall hear the voice of God and live. This state is sometimes termed Gehenna. It corresponds to the concupiscent nature of man, representing the obscurity and impurity of the human soul when dominated by its baser desires. Such are the characteristics of the initial or lowest sphere of spiritual being. The second sphere corresponds to man's intellectual or moral nature. It is termed paradise, the realm of happiness. Jesus declared to the thief on the cross, "Today shalt thou be with me in paradise." Yet 2 days later, when Mary encountered him at the tomb and sought to embrace him, he said, "Touch me not, for I have not yet ascended to my Father." He had resided in paradise, the second sphere, and he informed them that upon his ascension to the Father, they would behold him no longer. Both Gehenna and paradise are spheres of spiritual manifestation. Those who possess charity and truly spiritual affections are aligned with paradise, whereas those governed by carnal desires are aligned with the sphere of lust or Gehenna. Those who have traversed and fulfilled every impulse and affection within the second sphere are said to be admitted into the divine presence. They no longer require an intermediary between themselves and the divine, for the Father can then communicate with them directly. Conversely, as long as man remains either in the sphere of outer darkness or in paradise, there exists between him and the divine an intermediary agency capable of translating the things of the Father and rendering them manifest to his sensory perception. However, once man has ascended to the third sphere, An intermediary is no longer required. Christ himself becomes subject to the Father, and God becomes all in all. Thus commences the new dispensation, or the consummation of the Christian age. The salient point to which I wish to direct your attention is that all governance, both on earth and in heaven, is founded upon man, man being the ultimate summation of all the ages of eternity. All is synthesized within him, and he represents the consolidation of all that preceded him. Hence, all spiritual spheres have their foundation in the human being. Therefore, when we desire to study these spiritual spheres, we are not compelled to look beyond ourselves, searching space 10, 15, or 1,000 miles distant. The proper course is to turn inward and discern the sphere of spiritual being, perception, and affection. For the entirety of the spiritual universe is comprised of that which is founded upon the individual spirits who constitute those spheres. Just as earthly societies are composed of earthly individuals, so too are the celestial spheres composed of celestial individuals. Furthermore, the dominant character of these various spheres is merely the collective expression of the ruling loves of their inhabitants. The laws of the spheres are nothing other than the inherent laws of those who constitute them. We are germinal universes, destined to be consciously developed and unfolded until the entirety of the cosmos is translated into our consciousness. There exists but a solitary method for studying the universe, and that is to descend into ourselves and study our own nature. The notion of looking beyond ourselves, of relying upon any external mechanism outside of our own consciousness to discover what constitutes a spiritual sphere or degree, is entirely fallacious. Spirits may descend to rap, converse, and preach until the day of judgment. Yet, if they cannot find within your consciousness the elements wherewith to construct that spiritual sphere, you will remain incapable of perceiving or comprehending any true concept of spiritual realms. This is analogous to a person born blind, who has never beheld the light and consequently knows nothing of illumination, color, or darkness. Should someone endeavor to convince him that he resides in total darkness, there would be no faculty within his being to which that person could appeal to inspire belief. It would be impossible to convey the concept to his mind, as he possesses no conscious experience of light or color. External language alone cannot impart the concept. Unless one has had the conscious experience necessary to provide the raw material from which to construct the idea, spirits from the spiritual world may arrive from every sphere and degree, yet they will remain unable to convey an accurate conception of those realms to the mind. If they wish to make me comprehend who and what God is, they must discover within me the elements from which to construct that concept of God. I contend that it is futile to seek information outside of yourselves until you have comprehended what lies within. The primary lesson is to ascertain who and what I am. I propose to initiate my investigations within each individual's own consciousness, beginning with the self-evident affirmations of that consciousness and with definitions upon which we cannot disagree, and thereafter proceeding systematically to demonstrate every point and ascertain the law of manifestation as it is revealed within us. I do not petition spirits, nor do I desire them to descend to instruct me regarding the laws that govern their respective spheres. Indeed, we cannot escape the reality that all communications received with true comprehension must arrive through the method ordained by God. Namely, that they must be inscribed by His law upon our consciousness. Once so inscribed, spirits may then come to point out the writing to us, and that is the utmost they can achieve. I desire that you understand clearly the basis of my lectures and the specific points I shall attempt to establish. I shall endeavor to demonstrate the validity of spiritualism. I shall not address the phenomenon of spiritual raps for some time, as they are conceptually remote. Consequently, I shall not attempt to substantiate spiritualism by means of these raps for a considerable period. Although some assert that we have progressed beyond these auditory manifestations, the truth is that a significant portion of humanity has not yet reached them. They are not yet capable of appreciating such phenomena. Indeed, we must make considerable progress before we can grasp the underlying philosophy of the raps. We have yet much to learn before we can derive the full benefit of so simple an auditory phenomenon, even when it is not accompanied by any significant expression of intelligence. The initial lesson I shall endeavor to impart, forgive me for assuming the role of an instructor, as I remain ever willing to assume that of a disciple, concerns the method of studying and comprehending one's own nature, of ascertaining the laws governing your existence, conduct, and manifestation, of discerning what is spiritual within you and what is not, and of determining whether you reside under spiritual influence, for indeed, there exist laws by which all such matters may be resolved. In the course of my investigation, I shall perhaps succeed in locating the domain of that formidable entity, Jack the Giant Killer, otherwise known as the Odyllic Force, and demonstrate both its capacities and its limitations. Furthermore, I pledge, in the very presence of those theorists who assert that spiritual manifestations are attributable to this force, and to the complete satisfaction of all others, to demonstrate that it is utterly inadequate to produce them. This I shall demonstrate in accordance with the hypothesis of President Mahan. I shall prove by every established law of nature that the force exerted at the cerebral center in a single instance cited by him was equivalent to that of 1,000 steam engines, each of 1,000,000 horsepower, at a distance of 5 feet from the brain. Yet, this shall serve merely as collateral evidence when I address the objections raised against our theory. I shall endeavor to examine every objection that any dissenter has proposed to advance. I do not occupy this platform to boast, but that which I utter is to me absolute truth. I stand here undaunted, and invite intellects of every caliber to raise whatever objections they may against the spiritual theory, and I pledge myself to answer them instanter, or otherwise confess my inability to do so. This invitation commences henceforth, and remains open during every moment of my sojourn in this city. In my subsequent discourse, I shall initiate my remarks with the question of spiritual spheres, endeavoring to reveal to the consciousness of each of you the evidence of the existence of a primary sphere, from which you would all be wise to escape. I shall then proceed to demonstrate the existence of other spheres, specifically the second or relational sphere, and the third or divine sphere. I invite skeptics and atheists in particular to be exceedingly captious. Chapter 2. The Sphere of Lust. Man possesses a tripartite nature: the animal or sensuous, the intellectual and moral, and the divine. The mind, in whichever domain it manifests, possesses 2 distinct attributes: perception and affection, which correspond to understanding and love, or, when understanding is conjoined with genuine affection, wisdom and love. I have previously observed that since man, in the lowest aspect of his being, is animal in character, possessing the faculty of perceiving facts and phenomena, this faculty constitutes the perceptive dimension of his animal existence, encompassing self-love or the desire for self-gratification. That portion of the mind pertaining to the second dimension of human nature was described as that which investigates the laws and relations of entities, inquires into the domain of nature termed scientific, and studies all that concerns man and society. The so-called moral department of man's being is that which concerns the affectional aspect of his nature, designated as moral love or charity. That which pertains to the divine or absolute dimension of man's being was said to encompass the religious element within him, through which domain the infinite, as the absolute of existence and of affection, is to be revealed to the human mind. The love characterizing this sphere was described as divine love, the love of the divine being. The primary love is objective in the self, the secondary is objective in one's neighbor, and the tertiary is subjective in God. Thus was delineated the division of that department of the mind pertaining to human perception and affection. I shall now begin with the first aspect, man in the lowest department of his perception and affection, to demonstrate its nature and its manifestation within the individual, in society, in governance, and in the spiritual realm. If we desire to comprehend the laws that govern that region of the spiritual world designated as outer darkness, we need only study the laws governing the sphere of outer darkness that resides within man, and which man causes to manifest within society. A singular notion has prevailed that this lower, animal nature derives its qualities from the physical vessel we inhabit, and that, upon our separation from it, we shall no longer possess any vestige of that nature, as though this earthly frame were the foundation of perception or affection, as though the instrument were the cause, and as though this body, which we temporarily occupy, exerted greater dominion over us than the mind itself. I propose, therefore, first to inquire into the extent of the influence the body exerts upon the mind, and conversely, the influence the mind exerts upon the body, so that we may arrive at a reasonably precise conclusion regarding our condition beyond the grave. For if we can determine what portion of our animal nature is subtracted at death, we may ascertain how much of that nature persists once we have transcended the influence of these material bodies. My primary thesis is this: the manifestation of impulse in finite beings arises from the relation which one finite being sustains toward another. There exists no impulse that does not originate from this relationship, and the nature of the impulse corresponds to the character of that relation. In the divine order, if my body as a physical and finite entity sustained no relations, it would be subject to no impulse. Consequently, whenever I perceive an impulse arising within myself, I am thereby apprised that I bear a certain relation to some external object, and if I wish to acquire the wisdom necessary to govern that impulse, I must ascertain the nature of that relation. I might indeed retreat prior to the existence of mind or conscious being to demonstrate the uniformity of this law in the material or unconscious world, such as how the reciprocal influence between the earth and the sun arises from a specific relationship existing between them, and how, if one alters or destroys that relationship, the influence itself is altered or destroyed. However, I shall illustrate this truth by reference to a conscious being. Were man to be isolated from all laws, he would be a vastly different being from what he is at present, even though he might retain his current constitution, for he would then be unable to enter into those specific relations necessary to reveal certain affections within him. Let us consider, for example, the conjugal relation. It is that which approaches most nearly to the divine, being the primary relationship begotten beneath the infinite. Until a man and a woman enter into the true conjugal relation, they cannot experience that love known as conjugal love. Until that moment, it cannot be engendered within them. They may conjecture that they comprehend its nature, but until that true relationship is established between them, they can never possess an adequate conception of it, can never understand what it is to become so entirely absorbed in another as the true wife is in her husband, or the true husband in his wife. Nor can they, like a devoted husband and wife, experience that perfect harmony of soul, or listen to that exquisite spiritual music within, until they have entered this relation. which alone can prepare them for a genuine conjugal union. The law exists and the conditions exist, yet man must place himself and woman must place herself within the sphere of that law and those conditions, or they cannot enjoy the benefits derived therefrom. The same principle applies to the parental relation. No woman can comprehend maternal love until she becomes a mother. Is this not so, mothers? Individuals may conjecture that they understand its nature, supposing it to be merely a pure and affectionate sentiment existing between mother and child. Yet they can have no adequate conception of the profound tenderness and sanctity of maternal love. Their conception fails entirely to fathom the near-infinite depths of that sacred affection. There exists no possible means for an individual to comprehend maternal love other than by entering into the maternal relation. It is through this method that God reveals it within the soul. The reason for this lies in the fact that the true maternal impulse within the finite realm is the manifestation of the divine in the finite sphere, and this manifestation can occur within an individual only when that individual enters the sphere wherein the infinite may bestow that blessing. The same principle applies to paternal, fraternal, filial, and social love. The development of each depends upon those in whom they are manifested entering into the authentic relation that brings them forth. This identical law remains valid when applied to the relations existing between the physical body and the spirit. My body cannot be so nourished as to become an instrument for individualizing within me an immortal spirit, unless it is sustained by those elements necessary to constitute a part of its physical organism. As an immortal being, I possess needs that must be satisfied, lest I perish. And since these needs exist, there must be some means by which they manifest themselves to me, one of which is the sensation of hunger. An appetite for food announces a requirement of my decaying physical frame. The requisite sustenance may then be ingested to build it up and prepare it for its sacred mission of serving as an instrument in the elaboration of an immortal spirit. In like manner, thirst is the voice of God proclaiming a physical necessity, whereby my spirit is prompted to seek that which shall satisfy the demands of a divine impulse originating upon that plane. The same principle applies to all other physical needs that appeal to the spirit for gratification. Consequently, the impulses pertaining to this body do not originate within the body itself, but rather arise from the relationship the body sustains to the spirit. And once the spirit has fulfilled its duty of satisfying these physical requirements, the demand ceases. When, experiencing hunger, I have consumed the proper measure of sustenance, the desire for food is appeased. Thus it is with every other need. Once satisfied, the demand subsides, and the individual remains content until the need is once more generated. By examining the requirements of the body and familiarizing yourself with its condition in relation to the spirit, you may ascertain precisely how much influence, in truth and propriety, it exerts upon your soul. Yet when you look beyond these physical requirements and discover impulses clamoring for excess, you may be assured that these impulses do not originate in the body. Though they may seize upon your physical frame, stimulate it to action, and minister to its gratification, they do not arise from it, but rather from some neglected spiritual need. Such impulses are the voice of God directing our attention to some requirement we have forgotten or overlooked, and they will afford us no rest until we discover and satisfy that need. Let me illustrate this point. Although man, in the lower aspects of his nature, is animal, he is nonetheless far more than a mere animal in his active operations. The highest impulse of the brute is to sustain and protect its perishable, mortal structure, possessing no immortal spirit for which to provide in the future. It is content once the needs of its body are met. Have you never observed how peaceful and unconcerned are the horse and the dog when their desire for food has been satisfied? Immature animals and young children, in their play, are fulfilling a physical requirement of their developing frames. Yet, when children transition from childhood, assuming they mature into well-developed men and women, such desires cease, and others arise to take their place. Whereas the beast, once the demands of its animal nature are met, remains entirely satisfied. Consequently, one does not observe dissipation among animals. Have you ever reflected upon this? Beasts do not succumb to intoxication, nor do they seek gratification through unnatural channels. Animals remain true to nature and to God. They are incapable of harboring thoughts and desires that pertain to the immortal spirit, for their highest nature is purely physical. Were man as faithful to all the needs of his being as the animal is to those of its physical nature, he would not be the discontented, unhappy, and lustful creature he currently is. However, because he must satisfy the demands of a higher nature, he remains far less contented than the beast, whose animal desires are fully met. There exist spiritual needs pertaining to man's intellect and affections that he entirely overlooks or neglects, yet the demands of these needs are as imperative as those of his physical nature. The exigencies of his intellectual and moral being cause him to experience an internal deficit that destroys his peace and tranquility. He endeavors to remedy this deficiency by indulging his sensuous appetites and passions. Consequently, man descends into vice and becomes sinful. Were it not for his immortal yearning for the water of life, he would never become a corrupt or lustful being. Conversely, were he to satisfy the demands of that spiritual thirst, he would never experience discontent or succumb to lust. Let us now distinguish between the lustful impulse and the divine impulse, so that you may better comprehend the nature of the sphere to which I am directing your attention. We are all capable of discerning this difference by appealing to our own consciousness. The divine impulse apprises us of a genuine need and guides us to satisfy it. The infinite speaks only of necessities, leading man to fulfill them so that he may mature into a perfect being. Every impulse within man, from the lowest aspect of his nature to the highest, must be properly addressed if he is to attain perfection. The true impulse is that which fosters individual happiness and contentment. When an infant, impelled by this instinct, experiences hunger and cries for sustenance suited to its infantile nature, the satisfaction of that need is all that is required to quiet its cries. This is because the child is free from the lusts that afflict those of more advanced years. Of such is the kingdom of heaven. The infant does not yearn for substances merely to gratify or please its palate. It seeks only that which it requires, and once its needs are met, it demands no more. With the advancement of age, however, the child learns from worldly parents, or through exposure to corrupting influences, to seek gratification through lust, whereas in its original uncorrupted state, it recognized no impulses other than those which are natural, thereby obeying the true and divine law. Without pausing to investigate the origin of lust, I may assert that it necessarily arises from human ignorance. If you recall the imagery in the narrative of the Garden of Eden, you will remember that the transgression committed by Eve consisted in partaking of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It is from that very tree that we all partake. However, I do not intend to dwell upon the nature and origin of this lust in man, but wish merely to describe it as the defining characteristic of his lowest sphere of existence. It places him in antagonism with his neighbor and with God. It is the source of the abundant crime within him and the cause of ruin upon the earth. Lust is that which drives him to seek self-gratification irrespective of genuine need. Do you want access to this and all the complete audiobooks on the channel, plus the ebook version? Click the link in the description or scan the QR code in the left corner of the screen to access our library, where you can listen to your favorite esoteric books without ad interruptions, lock your screen, or use other apps while the narration plays, and even download the ebook version to follow along as you listen. Listen on your computer via web browser, or download the app from the Play Store. After subscribing, you will receive an email with your login details, password, and step-by-step instructions on how to access the books through the Hotmart app.